Imagine yourself living in the Middle Ages, where winter wasn't just a season, but a struggle for survival. Each morning, you wake up in your freezing home, and staying warm becomes the top priority. A relentless battle. Medieval houses, whether belonging to peasants or nobility, had unique characteristics that made finding shelter incredibly challenging. The core issue lay in their poor construction and insulation. Most common people's homes were built using the wattle and daub method, a wooden framework interwoven with branches and plastered with mud mixed with straw or animal dung. The walls were only a few inches thick, completely inadequate to block out the biting cold winds. Even the stone houses of the wealthy weren't much better. Mortar would often crack in the cold, creating significant gaps for drafts to seep through. Windows and roofs were also critical weak points. Windows were typically crude openings, covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth, never glass. When blizzards hit, closing the shutters for warmth meant risking suffocation from the indoor fire smoke, a truly grim choice. Thatched roofs, while seemingly thick, easily became waterlogged when snow melted, turning the inside of the house into an unwanted rainy scene, and could even collapse under the weight of ice and snow. Floors were usually packed dirt or clay, sometimes covered with straw or rushes for added insulation. However, in winter, they transformed into a layer of frozen mud, sucking away any warmth from the feet. The straw covering also provided an ideal breeding ground for mice, fleas, and other pests, turning the home into a hotel teeming with unwelcome guests. The heating system and smoke management presented a major challenge. The only fire was lit in a central fire pit, serving to cook, warm, and light the space simultaneously. The roof opening often wasn't sufficient to vent smoke, leading to the entire house being filled with thick fumes when the wind shifted. Burning eyes and scorched lungs were an unavoidable part of daily life, contributing to chronic respiratory illnesses. Chimneys were very rare and often ineffective when they did exist. As for sleeping arrangements, bedrooms were almost never heated to conserve precious fuel. People wore all their clothes to bed and piled on thick wool or fur blankets. Entire families often shared beds to combine body heat for survival. On particularly cold nights, frost would even form on the interior walls of the house. Even the living conditions of wealthy families were far from comfortable. They might have had portable metal braziers filled with burning charcoal, but these were expensive, dangerous, and prone to carbon monoxide poisoning if not properly ventilated. In summary, surviving a medieval winter was an arduous ordeal, where even the house, meant to be a refuge, became part of the struggle. Braziers, metal containers filled with burning charcoal that could be moved around the house. However, these were expensive, dangerous, and produced deadly fumes if not properly ventilated. Medieval portable heating was like playing Russian roulette with invisible poison gas. In essence, a medieval winter turned every home into a fragile fortress against the elements, where every breath, every step, was a struggle for mere existence. Imagine the crisp, cool air of late autumn in a medieval village. The fields, once bursting with life, now lay bare, and the last vestiges of the year's bounty were being painstakingly gathered. For medieval people, this wasn't just about stocking the pantry. It was a desperate race against time, a high-stakes gamble where losing meant starvation. Harvest season and preservation techniques were literally the difference between life and death. Every bushel of grain, every cured piece of meat, represented a small victory against the encroaching famine that winter inevitably brought. Farmers were gamblers, betting their lives on the success of their crops and the effectiveness of their crude preservation methods. Salt was the most common preservative, but it was astronomically expensive, far beyond the generous reach of most peasant families. This precious commodity had to be used sparingly, if at all, for salting meats, turning them into tough, leathery jerky that often spoiled anyway if the process wasn't exactly right. Smoking meat was another labor-intensive method, requiring weeks of constant attention and the right type of wood, lest too much heat cooked the meat or too little left it vulnerable to rot. Keeping fires burning day and night for extended periods was a monumental task, and the subtle art of selecting wood for flavor and preservation quality was a skill passed down through generations, yet still prone to failure. The challenges in preserving meat and vegetables were immense. Meat, once slaughtered in the autumn, had to be dealt with swiftly. Beyond salting and smoking, some might be dried into jerky that had the texture and taste of old leather, a far cry from a modern culinary delight. Vegetables presented their own unique dilemmas. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be buried in cool, dry places, but many would still succumb to freezing solid or rotting before the first hint of spring. Cabbage, a hearty staple, could be fermented into sauerkraut, creating a sour, mushy substance that was barely palatable but offered a vital source of nutrients. Onions could be braided and hung in dry, airy spaces, but eventually, they too would sprout or rot, their usefulness fading with each passing week. Grain storage issues were a constant battle against moisture, mold, and pests. Wheat and barley, the very staff of life, were typically kept in cloth sacks or crude wooden barrels that were far from airtight. One damp spell, one unexpected leak in the roof, could ruin an entire family's grain supply, turning it into a moldy, sickening mess. Medieval pantries were essentially uncontrolled science experiments where failure meant certain death. Rats, the ultimate grain thieves, were ubiquitous, finding ways into almost any storage container. They didn't just eat the grain. They contaminated everything with their droppings, rendering even untouched portions dangerous to consume. A single rat family could destroy weeks' worth of food in a shockingly short time, often forcing families to consume contaminated food out of sheer desperation. The fate of livestock and the rationing system was inextricably linked to human survival. Most peasant families simply couldn't afford to feed their livestock through the long winter months, as animals required grain that humans desperately needed to survive. Consequently, most cattle, pigs, and chickens were slaughtered in the fall. This created a temporary abundance of fresh meat that had to be preserved quickly before it spoiled, adding immense pressure to an already strained household. The mental stress of watching food supplies shrink day by day was enormous. Families would begin rationing early in winter, meticulously calculating exactly how much they could eat each day to make their meager supplies last until spring. Medieval diet plans were designed not by choice, but by the stark reality of impending starvation. The diet during scarcity was brutal. Bread made from old or even moldy grain was often the only option available. This bread was hard, bitter, and sometimes contained fungi that could cause illness or death. People would soak stale bread in whatever liquid was available, water, thin ale, or even weak broth, just to make it edible. During the worst times, bread was made from ground acorns, bark, or other substances that provided minimal nutrition, barely staving off the gnawing pangs of hunger. Parents, driven by an instinct to protect their young, would often give their portions to their children, slowly starving themselves to keep their families alive, a silent act of profound sacrifice. Even for the privileged, access to food for the wealthy was limited during winter months. While they certainly fared better than the common folk, enjoying imported delicacies like spices, dried fruits, and preserved fish, these luxuries were not immune to the season's challenges. Trade routes became impassable due to snow, ice, or treacherous terrain, and merchants couldn't transport goods safely. Medieval grocery shopping had a 6-month off-season, with no rain checks or deliveries, meaning even the lord in his castle faced a restricted menu. The flow of goods that connected communities in warmer months simply ceased. Thus, whether rich or poor, the medieval winter tested everyone's resilience, transforming the act of eating from a simple necessity into a daily struggle for bare survival. As the medieval winter deepened, the biting cold didn't bring rest. Instead, it multiplied the arduousness of every daily task, turning routine chores into Herculean feats of endurance. Medieval winter schedules were like trying to fit a full day's work into a coffee break, where every minute counted, and every action was physically demanding. Water collection transformed into a daily wrestling match with nature. Wells, streams, and ponds froze over with ice thick enough to walk on, often several inches deep. Breaking through this formidable barrier required heavy tools, axes, picks, or large stones, muscle power, and stubborn determination. Once the ice was breached, the race against time began, hauling water back home before it froze solid in the containers. Clay pots, vital for storage, would crack if water turned to ice inside them, destroying valuable vessels that took skilled potters weeks to make. Medieval water delivery was a relentless relay race against the laws of physics. Firewood gathering became a never-ending treasure hunt, where the treasure literally kept you alive. Early winter offered a bounty of dead branches and fallen trees, but as these were consumed, people had to venture farther from home, enduring bitter cold and difficult terrain, and work harder for fuel. Freshly cut wood had to be seasoned and dried before it would burn properly, a process that took time and careful planning. Cutting frozen wood was backbreaking labor that tested both tools and human endurance. Axes would stick in frozen logs as if glued, requiring immense strength to pull free. Metal tools, precious and irreplaceable, became brittle in extreme cold and could shatter if struck incorrectly. People learned to warm their tools by the fire before use and work in short, intense bursts. Caring for livestock demanded constant attention during winter months. Animals had to be sheltered, fed, and kept warm enough to survive the biting cold. Many families brought their cows, pigs, and chickens indoors during the coldest periods, effectively turning medieval homes into combination human and animal shelters. While the animals provided some additional warmth, they also created significant sanitation problems, adding another layer of daily chores. Roof and tool maintenance became critical for survival. Snow would pile up until roofs sagged precariously under the weight, threatening to collapse entirely. Ice dams would form, creating leaks that had to be patched immediately, a dangerous task involving climbing onto icy roofs. Ignoring these problems could quickly render a house uninhabitable. Tool care was equally essential. Axes, knives, and hammers had to be sharpened, cleaned, and maintained constantly. A broken tool often meant the difference between completing necessary work and facing serious problems, highlighting the preciousness of metal in a largely agrarian society. Indoor work and clothing repair continued around the clock. Wool had to be spun into thread, thread woven into cloth, and cloth sewn into clothing and blankets. This detailed work was often done by dim firelight, straining eyes and requiring intense focus. Clothing repair was ongoing and essential. Garments had to last for years, so every tear or worn spot required immediate attention, often resulting in garments that were more patches than original material. Finally, food preparation took much longer when everything was frozen or heavily preserved. Vegetables had to be thawed and cleaned carefully. Preserved meats needed lengthy soaking to remove excess salt. Simple meals became complex projects requiring hours of preparation. Medieval cooking was like preparing dinner while wearing mittens in a freezer. The relentless physical demands of winter work wore people down quickly. Malnutrition made everyone weaker, while cold weather made muscles stiff and joints painful, leading to chronic conditions from the constant strain of winter survival. In the brutal medieval winter, survival was a daily gamble, and unfortunately, all the exhausting physical work and harsh conditions left people vulnerable in ways they never expected. When injury or illness struck, the outlook was bleak, for medieval medicine was about as advanced as medieval space travel, which is to say, it barely existed. Medical knowledge was a chaotic blend of superstition, ancient traditions, and sheer guesswork, utterly devoid of scientific understanding. Most people believed that illness was caused by bad air, divine punishment, or an imbalance of bodily humors, concepts that offered little practical help against real diseases. Wound care and infection were a terrifying lottery. Cleaning injuries typically consisted of applying whatever liquid was handy, most commonly water, sometimes wine if a family could afford it, and occasionally other fluids people mistakenly believed had healing properties. Medieval first aid was like playing medical roulette with dirty water. Infection was a silent, insidious killer that no one understood. Tiny bacteria, invisible to the naked eye, were far deadlier than wolves or bears. A small cut from a kitchen knife could quickly develop red streaks, cause fever, and eventually lead to death through blood poisoning. People observed that some wounds healed while others festered, but they had no understanding of why. The lack of understanding extended to medical tools and contamination. The same knife that butchered a pig might then be used to cut bread, and subsequently, to treat a wound. Needles used for sewing were also employed for medical procedures. The revolutionary idea that tools could carry invisible contamination was utterly foreign to medieval thinking, making every intervention a potential vector for further illness. Common winter injuries were rampant. Frostbite was a frequent and devastating winter injury, often leading to serious complications. Fingers and toes would turn white, then purple, then black as tissue died from a lack of blood flow. Treatment often involved warming the affected area, sometimes with direct heat, that actually made the damage worse. Severe frostbite often necessitated amputation of dead fingers or toes, a horrific surgery performed without any pain relief, using crude tools like pliers or knives. Patients would bite on leather strips to endure the agony, and even if they survived the amputation, the risk of infection afterward was often fatal. Burns were a constant threat due to open fires and cooking accidents, treated with various substances like butter, honey, or mud, some harmless, others introducing more infection. Broken bones were set using wooden boards and cloth, but without knowledge of how bones actually healed, many mended incorrectly, leaving people with crooked limbs and chronic pain. Pain relief was almost non-existent. Willow bark could be chewed for mild comfort, but it wasn't always available and offered little help for serious injuries. Most people simply endured whatever pain they experienced. The ability to tolerate pain was considered a virtue. To make matters worse, parasites made every injury worse. Lice, fleas, and various worms lived on and inside human bodies, carrying diseases and hindering healing. These parasites would infest wounds, making infection more likely and healing more difficult. Dental problems were universal and could become life-threatening, as infections could spread to the brain or bloodstream. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia, using crude tools. Eye injuries were particularly serious due to work in dim light with dangerous tools. Sparks, splinters, or sharp implements could cause permanent blindness with no available treatment, rendering victims completely dependent on their families. The omnipresent fear of injury shaped every aspect of daily life. People moved carefully, avoided risks when possible, but still couldn't prevent all accidents. Every activity carried the potential for injury, and people were constantly aware that a single mistake could be fatal. As medieval individuals struggled desperately for survival against the harsh winter, entire communities began to face their own breaking points. Medieval village cooperation was like a house of cards built during an earthquake. It looked stable until pressure hit, then everything collapsed at once. During good times, communities functioned on principles of mutual aid, shared resources, and collective responsibility. However, winter conditions tested these bonds to their breaking point. The erosion of mutual aid was swift and brutal. Neighbors who had always helped each other suddenly became fiercely protective of their meager supplies when everyone was struggling to survive. Generosity became a luxury that few families could afford, transforming shared burdens into solitary struggles. Medieval sharing was like trying to split a single cracker among 20 hungry people. Borrowing and lending became sources of intense conflict instead of community bonding. When someone borrowed grain or firewood in December, both parties knew repayment was unlikely. The informal credit systems that worked during harvest season failed completely when there were no extra resources to share. The unwritten rules that held communities together during other seasons shattered under winter pressure. People who had always been reliable neighbors might suddenly refuse to share basic necessities, leading to deep resentment. Social hierarchies became more pronounced, and the abandonment by nobility was stark. Wealthy families often hoarded resources, while poor families faced starvation. Churches and monasteries tried to provide assistance, but they faced the same shortages as everyone else. Religious institutions could only distribute what they had, which often wasn't much. Wealthy landowners, who normally provided some protection for their tenants in exchange for labor and loyalty, often disappeared during winter months, retreating to better supplied castles or traveling to warmer regions. The feudal system promised protection, but broke down precisely when it was needed most. Geographic isolation and communication issues compounded the problems. Villages might be separated by miles of dangerous, snow-covered terrain that became impassable during storms. Medieval communication networks had the reliability of smoke signals in a hurricane. When illness struck, communities faced terrible choices. Helping sick neighbors meant risking infection, but refusing help meant watching people die alone. Families with sick members were often shunned by their neighbors, creating a cruel isolation precisely when support was most needed. The desperation for limited resources inevitably led to increased theft and violence. Families, driven by hunger and cold, would steal firewood, food, or anything else they needed to survive. Accusations of theft could tear apart relationships that had taken generations to build, eroding the social trust that held communities together. Local authorities struggled to maintain order, and markets collapsed. Traveling to resolve disputes or enforce laws was difficult and dangerous, leaving many conflicts unresolved until spring, allowing resentments to fester. The weekly market days, which provided not just economic opportunities, but also news, gossip, and social interaction, disappeared for months at a time, deepening the sense of isolation. This rendered any emergency response largely ineffective. By the time neighbors realized someone was in serious trouble, that person might already be beyond saving. Medieval emergency response was like calling for help and hoping someone would find your body before spring. As communities crumbled and people weakened from months of hardship, winter saved its deadliest weapon for last. Medieval winters created disease-breeding grounds that would make modern scientists run away screaming. The horrifying confluence of factors promoting illness was so complete and devastating that epidemics were virtually inevitable every season. Medieval winter health conditions were like a biological weapons laboratory run by amateurs. Cold temperatures, poor nutrition, and cramped living conditions transformed human bodies into welcome mats for every illness in the area. People's natural defenses were already severely weakened from chronic hunger and stress, making them about as resistant to disease as paper towels are to water. The immune systems that might have fought off infections during healthier times were utterly compromised by malnutrition. Respiratory illnesses were the biggest killers during winter months. Simple colds rapidly developed into pneumonia, which was essentially a death sentence. Constant exposure to its smoke had already damaged most people's lungs, making them profoundly more vulnerable to serious infections. Medieval winter air quality was like breathing through a wet sock filled with ash. Influenza swept through communities like wildfire through dry grass. The virus would arrive with a traveler, and within days, entire households would be bedridden with fever, aches, and severe breathing difficulties. The close quarters that families used for warmth also tragically facilitated rapid disease transmission. Disease transmission from livestock created new opportunities for pathogens to jump between animals and humans. Families who brought cows, pigs, and chickens indoors for warmth also inadvertently invited whatever illnesses these animals carried. The poor sanitation resulting from housing humans and animals together created ideal conditions for widespread bacterial infections. Waterborne illnesses remained common even in winter, because water sources were often contaminated with waste from both humans and animals. Drinking water was frequently more dangerous than the diseases it was supposed to help treat. Ice and snow didn't purify water. They just made contamination harder to detect. Tuberculosis thrived in the cold, damp conditions of medieval homes, spreading through respiratory droplets in poorly ventilated spaces where multiple people lived together. The chronic coughing characteristic of tuberculosis was often mistaken for a normal winter cough until the disease had progressed too far to treat. Children were especially vulnerable to winter diseases. Their smaller bodies couldn't fight infections as effectively as adults, and they needed more calories per pound to maintain body heat. Child mortality rates during winter were staggering, with some communities losing a quarter of their children every winter. Treatment options were limited and often made patients worse instead of better. Bloodletting was a popular but debilitating treatment, weakening already struggling individuals. Herbal remedies were rarely effective or available when most needed. This grim reality fostered a pervasive fear of illness and impending pandemics. People avoided gatherings and became suspicious of anyone who seemed even slightly unwell. When disease outbreaks occurred during resource shortages, the results were catastrophic. Weakened populations couldn't fight off infections, and communities lacked the means to care for the sick. The medieval winter was nature's ultimate endurance test, where survival required constant vigilance, unwavering determination, and more than a little luck to see another spring.